Hey guys, it's Angela from the App Brewery, and in this lesson, we're going to deep dive into how exactly does the internet work. So, what exactly is the internet? A lot of people think it's a cloud, something that's hanging around in the sky, it's super complex, super difficult to understand, but actually that's not it at all. The internet is pretty simple. All it is just a long piece of wire. And the wire connects different computers to each other. So you might have one computer that's in London and another one that's in Seattle, and they can talk to each other and transfer data through this giant wire. Now, some of these computers attached to the internet have a very special job. They have to be online 24/7, ready to serve you all the data and files that you are requesting when you try to access a website. And these are called servers. And what they do is they serve you all the data and files you need to be able to access and interact with certain websites. So these computers are called servers, and any computer that a user would use to access the internet is called a client. Now you can imagine a web server as a giant library that's open 24/7, and you can go in there at any hour of the day and say, I want to see Google's homepage, or I want to see the latest post on TechCrunch, and it would be able to serve you with all the files and data you would need to be able to view whatever website you want. Now, as you can imagine, if there's a library that's big enough to house all of these websites, then it's going to be pretty difficult to quickly locate the thing that you want out of this giant library, right? So how is this problem solved on the internet? Well, let's say that you're sitting at home on your computer and you type in google.com because you want to head over to the main Google homepage. Well, what happens behind the scenes is that your browser will send that message to your ISP, or your internet service provider. So these are the people who you pay to be able to access the internet. If you live in the US, that will be AT&T or Comcast, and if you're in the UK, that will be something like BT or TalkTalk. Now, the message that you're sending the ISP is, I want to see google.com, and the ISP will then relay that message to something called a DNS server, which stands for a Domain Name System Server. And a DNS server is essentially just a souped up phone book. And what happens when you make that request through your browser is the DNS server will look up in its database to find the exact IP address of that website that you're trying to access. And every single computer that's connected to the internet has an IP address. It's kind of like a postal code for your computer, so that when people need to send and receive files on the internet, each computer can be located and contacted using their unique IP address. And once the DNS server finds that IP address, it'll send it back to your browser through the ISP over the internet. Then you can make a direct request to that address. And what lives at that IP address is, of course, the Google servers. And they'll be able to send you back all the files and data you need to be able to view the Google homepage. Now, you can try this for yourself to look up the IP address of the Google homepage. Head over to this website, nslookup.io, and type in google.com. And they should show you the exact IP address of the Google servers that you can access. So if you copy it and paste it into a new tab, then you'll be able to replicate that process and see the Google homepage show up. So to summarize, the internet is just a bunch of wires that connects up different computers. But it's just on a much bigger scale, connecting up all the computers in the world. But what about the oceans, I hear you ask? Well, that's one of the coolest things. There are these massive undersea cables connecting all the continents on Earth. And if you head over to submarinecablemap.com, you can see all of these cables and see the ones that connect you up to the internet. And these undersea cables are massive, consisting of hundreds of fiber optic fibers, each of them using lasers to transmit up to 400 gigabytes of data per second. This is a cross-section of one of the cables that run to the New. It's an absolute marvel of modern technology, and it looks really beautiful, don't you think? And to think that every single time we load up a web page or click on a button on a website, behind the scenes, we're sending signals that navigate all of this crazy underwater and above water wires. And all I need is just an IP address. And through tiny electric signals traveling at the speed of light through the oceans and halfway around the world in a matter of milliseconds, I get to view my favorite website. And that is how awesome the internet is. And we're going to be taming it to build our own website and web apps. And to be able to do that, we first have to understand how exactly do websites work. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. Hey guys, it's your host Angela here. Welcome to another episode in your favorite show that should really be on Netflix. In this episode, we're going to learn exactly how websites actually work and understand the role of the browser and the different files that it uses to render your favorite web pages. Previously on the Complete Web Development Bootcamp, you learned that the internet consists of a wire that connects client computers with server computers. And you learned that there are special kinds of server computers called domain name service servers, which acts as a big old Yellow Pages phone book and can look up the IP address of any website you want to access. And when you find out that IP address, you can directly hit up the server computer for the website that you want to view, and they'll send you all the files and data for your browser to be able to render it on screen. Now, the data that you receive from that server usually consists of three types of files: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And it's very likely that you would have come across these types of files or these words before because they're so common and they are so integral to how websites work. But what exactly do they do? And why are there so many different types of files? Why can't we just have one file that's, a website? Well, they actually have very different jobs. So, for example, the HTML code file is responsible for the content in your website. So if a website was a house, then the HTML would be the actual bricks of the house. It's the raw materials that makes up your house. Similarly, the HTML file contains the content of your website, like the text content, or the images, or buttons, or links. The second type of files are the CSS files. And these are responsible for styling your website, like the color of the walls or the shape of your door. The CSS file determines how your website will look. So what color will the background of the page be? Or will the buttons have rounded corners? It targets all the content in your website that you created using HTML, for example, the text or the buttons, and applies the styling to those elements. So you could use CSS to make a button red and have rounded corners, and the button text to have a particular font. That is what CSS is for. Now, the final component is the JavaScript code. And this is the code that allows your website to actually do things or have functionality. So if you were building a house, this would be like adding light bulbs that can turn on and off, or putting in a cooker that can actually turn on a fire to heat your food. It turns your house into a home, and the JavaScript code does exactly that for a website. It turns a static website, which just has pretty images or text, into something that a user can actually interact with. For example, send an email in Gmail or post your breakfast on Instagram. It allows your website to actually do things and become functional, not just something pretty to look at. So if we take the Google homepage as an example again, once we receive these three types of files from the Google server, we can use our browser, which is a piece of software that specializes in dealing with these files. So when the browser loads up the HTML, we'll get to see the content of the website. So in this case, there's one image which has the Google logo, there's two buttons, and there's a text box where we can enter our search term. Now, when the browser then loads up the CSS files, then it will modify the appearance of those components. So we don't get any extra buttons or images or anything with the CSS, but it will now look exactly the way Google wanted it to. The shape of that text box or the color of the buttons. And finally, using the JavaScript file, the browser gives us the functionality of this website. So we can type in a search term like Google in 1998. And by the way, you should really try this in Google, because when you hit search, it'll turn Google into what it looked like in 1998. So with all these three different files, we get the content, we get the styling, and finally we get the functionality of the website. And combined together is how we create modern websites. Now, with all this knowledge that we've already acquired, we can already start messing around with real websites on the internet. So if you open up your browser and head over to google.com, you can right-click on the button, which is Google Search, and click on Inspect. Now, what this does is it brings up the Chrome developer tools. Now, Chrome has one of the best tool suites for web developers like us. This is why at the beginning of the course, I asked you to download the Chrome browser, even if you normally use a different browser. So if you haven't yet downloaded Chrome, be sure to do it now before you continue. Otherwise, some of the things that I say might not work. In the coming lessons, we're going to be exploring the Chrome developer tools in a lot more detail. But for now, we're just going to use it to do something really simple. So you can see that Chrome developer tools has automatically highlighted the part of the code that's responsible for that button that I right-clicked on, that I wanted to inspect. And if we look carefully, you can see that the title of the button, which says Google Search, is actually in here, and we can find it right here, just after the word value. And if we double click on it, then we can actually edit this title for it to say something completely different. So instead of Google Search, let's call it Angela Search. And then once I hit enter, you'll see that update over here. Now you'll notice there's also one called ARIA label, Google Search, and this is actually only for text readers rather than for our browser. You can change that too, but it just means that you won't really see it on screen. It's updating something that's used behind the scenes. So be sure to double click on the correct thing. Now, depending on what HTML content we're inspecting on, the part that we have to change might be different. So for example, if you wanted to change the headlines on TechCrunch.com, you can simply right-click on one of those headlines, click Inspect, and find the part that corresponds to this headline, which is right here in black, and we can double-click on it to say something completely different. And you can actually change the front page of TechCrunch or BBC News or any website you want to. So this is a great way of pranking your friends, especially when they can see that you're on TechCrunch.com and the title or any of the other pieces of text can say whatever you want it to. And this is a great joke to play on friends who are maybe not quite as technologically advanced as you, because they haven't taken the course that you have. Now, unfortunately, when I hit refresh on this website, you'll see that everything gets restored to the original version of the website. And the reason for this is because when we hit refresh, we're asking TechCrunch's servers to deliver us the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files once again so that we can render the website on our browser. But when we edit our website in the Chrome developer tools, effectively what we're changing is our local version. And this doesn't get saved when you hit refresh. So of course, then the website will update to the original content. But in the coming lessons, we're going to be working with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript so that you can create and host your own websites live on the internet. And through learning how to code and how to build websites, you're going to be able to make websites that say anything you want it to, look the way that you want it to, and have the functionality that you need. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. Hi guys, and welcome to the course. Now, after thousands of students have taken this course, I've compiled some of the top tips from the most successful students to help you make the most of your time on the course. So I know what I do with instruction manuals when I receive them, but this is not it, because I want to share with you some of the most useful useful tips that will help you learn to code and get the most out of the course. So first tip is, as you go from lesson to lesson in the course, you'll find that each of the lessons should take about 10 minutes long. And this is something that we intentionally designed for the course. Now, a lot of students, when they're watching video tutorials online, very often what people do is they'll watch the video and type along to the code. And this is what we tend to call code along. So the tutorial types a bit, you type a bit, you try to keep up with the pace of the tutorial, or you pause the video every so often to catch up. But essentially, you're coding along with the instructor. And this is probably one of the most intuitive ways for people to learn from online tutorials. Now, in order for you to be more successful than most people, what I would recommend is instead to watch the video tutorials, which are usually, as I said, about 10 minutes long. If it's a 20-minute or a 50-minute tutorial, then stop it at around the 10-minute mark. And while you're watching it, instead of spending time trying to frantically type out the code, I want you instead to just try and understand what's going on, why the code is being written, and understand the purpose of the code rather than trying to type along at the same pace. Now, once you've understood what those 10 minutes are about, what the tutorial is trying to teach you, then to go to your computer and type out the code and try to replicate what happened in the 10 minutes. Now, the reason why this helps people learn so much better is because instead of just copying code by rote, which doesn't teach you anything, instead it forces you to really understand what's going on and absorb the content, and then test yourself afterwards to see if you really understood. So this is my number one top tip. And it's important to remember that we are learning programming. We're not learning how to type fast. It doesn't help you become a better programmer by just copying out code as fast as you can. If you wanted to practice your typing and to speed up your typing skills, then I recommend something like Keyber.com, where you can focus on that specific skill to improve your speed of typing. But what we're going to focus on in the course is learning programming. So we're going to keep our eye on the prize. Now, while you're listening to the videos and you're understanding what's going on, I recommend taking a few notes for yourself to come back to or review in the future. And this is especially useful after when those 10 minutes are up and you're trying to remember what are those bits of code that you had to type and what was the theory that was covered. So one of my favorite note-taking systems is something called Cornell Notes. And it's very, very simple. It just splits a single note page into 4 sections. The top, you have the topic, what the notes are about. And then you have the section of notes where you would write down the majority of your notes. Now, after you write a few lines, it's recommended that you go and review those notes and pick out the most important keywords or questions that you're asking yourself that you want to research on later, or any sort of hints or reminders to yourself. And finally, once you've completed the lesson, then you go to the summary section and you summarize what the entire lesson was about in a few bullet points. So I've created a downloadable PDF of this note-taking system. So if you're keen to try it out, go ahead and download it from the course resources section, and you can print it out into a notebook or just on a few loose sheets if you want to try it out. Now, the next thing to remember is that if I'm talking too fast or too slow, you can always change the playback speed. Now, if you're in a lesson that you find particularly easy to understand and you already know most of the concepts, then go ahead and switch the video player to double speed so that you can cover much more ground in the same space of time. Now, on the other hand, if I'm talking too fast or if English is not your first language, then feel free to change the speed to half speed so that I talk a lot slower and you can take up the information more readily. But it's important that you try to not skip any of the tutorials and any of the modules. And the reason is because the curriculum was carefully designed so that it would be a smooth sloping ramp, so that you start out at the beginning and you slowly make your way through more and more difficult concepts. Now, if you skip a couple of modules, then it makes it really, really hard for you to catch up and to understand what's going on, which is the most important thing. However, some of the videos I will label with optional or skippable, and in that case, feel free to skip those lessons if they don't interest you. Now, the next thing to remember is that if you find at any point the tutorials become harder, and they inevitably will be, they're designed to get harder and harder. But if you find that it's a little bit too difficult, then I recommend just bookmarking it, making a note of which module you really struggled with, and trying to use that method of watching the videos for 10 minutes, reviewing what has been taught, trying to replicate the code yourself. But if you're still stuck and you really don't understand what's going on, then that might be something that you have to come back to. So I find that usually with programming concepts, it helps to try it out, read around the topic, and then come back to it after a week or so. And very often, what was very, very difficult first time you come across it, after you've done it a few times, after you've researched around the topic, and then you come back to it, it becomes a lot easier. So remember to mark things for review that you don't understand. Now, recently, I went to learn windsurfing in Mykonos, and it's a skill that I've never had before. It's something that I found incredibly challenging, and I fell on my face during the entire lesson pretty much, and it hurt a lot. I got battered and bruised, and my ego got bruised a lot as well. But this is exactly what it's like when you try to learn a new skill. So it's important that you persevere and continue to put in the hours to practice and to try again, because you can learn something very superficially just by watching a video or, trying it for a few hours. But in order to master a skill, the most important thing is practice. Now, the final thing is that, I will say it now, you will get stuck at some point, because everybody does. And in fact, I wish that Hollywood would stop making movies where programmers are just typing away like some sort of frenzied hacker person. Because most of the programmers I know who actually do this as a job, they spend probably 90% of their time just staring at the screen, trying to figure out what is wrong? Why is it not working? So getting stuck is very much a universal part of programming, something that you have to come to even love and enjoy. So when you do find yourself stuck, I want you to imagine that you're already a fully fledged developer working a job where somebody's paying you to do this for them, because you're the professional. So I want you to use the tools that professional programmers use when they get stuck, and that is Google and Stack Overflow. You try to figure it out, try to see what did other people do, because 99% of the time you won't be the first person who's come across that problem. It's very likely that somebody's experienced it before and other people have helped them to solve that problem or help them understand what it is that they're stuck on. And the thing to remember is that struggling is good. In that moment when you finally spot that typo or finally figure out why it is that your code isn't working and you fix it, that is one of the best feelings in the world. So struggle is good, and it really is through the struggles that you actually improve and level up your skills. So I'm so excited to be on this journey with you, and I look forward to all of your success in the future. All right, guys, it's Angela from the App Brewery again. So at this stage, I'm presuming that you've probably at some point in your life done a tutorial or a lesson somewhere else out there on the internet. And inevitably, at some point, you'll probably get stuck on a problem. Now, I spend a lot of time thinking about how I can make the course such that you get stuck less often. But with programming, it's almost a core part of the learning process that you do get stuck and you get yourself unstuck. So I tend to find that when I get stuck on something, I try to see it as a challenge, because usually when I solve it and when I figure it out, there is a huge sense of satisfaction and there's usually some associated growth. Now, having taught over 100,000 students online and offline, I've seen people struggle in lots of different ways. And I just wanted to summarize the steps that you can go through when you get stuck on any sort of programming problem and the framework that you can use to get yourself unstuck in the quickest way possible. Now, the first step is to evaluate what is the expectation versus what is the reality. What did you expect your code to do? Or what did you expect to happen? And what actually happened? So every time you run your code, think to yourself, what do I expect to happen? And then see what really happened and try to figure out what is causing the difference. Now, while you're writing code, it's inevitable that you will end up creating errors. And this can happen when you've made a mistake or spelled something wrong, or even when you're just trying to install a piece of software. And those errors are usually accompanied by bits of text or the error message. And you can see this in your browser or in your code editor. And most of the time, it might seem like these error messages are written by aliens because they don't seem to make any sense. But you can quite easily figure out the human meaning in English for it by just putting it into Google. And you'll usually get lots of different answers as to what the cause might be and how you can fix the problem. And one of the websites, if you don't already know about it, it's going to shortly become your very best friend, and that is stackoverflow.com. So I recommend searching for any errors that you come across into Google and then heading towards the Stack Overflow websites that come up as a result. And this is exactly what real life developers do every single day. And in fact, I've worked in teams where we will all just go to the pub and have a drink and end the day if Stack Overflow is no longer working. So it's all a part of the developer workflow. Now, if that still didn't help, or you're confused by the results that you're getting back, then it's a good idea to re-watch some of the video up to the point when the code started breaking or it started doing something unexpected. Because in the videos, there are always step-by-step instructions, and it's really important that you check to make sure that you haven't made a typo here or there, or you haven't capitalized something that shouldn't be capitalized, and just re-watch the video right before when your code broke in order to try and figure out what might have gone wrong. Now, the next step is you can check your code against my code. At the end of every tutorial module, there is a completed project that you can download, and you can scroll through the completed code, compare it to your own, and see if there were any typos, any errors, any mistakes. And if it helps, you can even copy and paste sections from the completed code into your own module just to see if that line or that paragraph helped to fix the issue. And if that still doesn't solve it, then the next step is head towards the Q&A. So underneath every lesson, there is a Q&A section. And it's a good idea to check in the lesson when your app has broken to see whether if anybody else had similar issues to you. And if you can't find anybody with the same issues, then ask in the Q&A. But make sure that you ask your question in the lesson where you're having the issues. That way it makes it much easier for other students to be able to learn from your mistakes, and also for me to be able to quickly identify what the problem might be. And if you have a question about anything in the tutorial, it's a good idea just to include the timestamp at which it occurs in the video, so I can quickly watch it. and figure out what you're referring to so that I can better answer your questions. Now, when you're asking questions in the Q&A, the way to get the most helpful responses and solutions is by following a 4-step approach. So firstly, tell us, so myself and other students, what did you expect to happen? Then what actually happened? And then include a screenshot of all of your code that corresponds to this situation, and then include a screenshot of the debug console. That includes any errors, if there were any errors or if your app has crashed. Now, to take a screenshot of part of the screen in Windows, all you have to do is hold down the Windows key, Shift and S, and then you'll get these little crosshairs show up, and you'll be able to take a section of your screen as a screenshot. And once you let go of the mouse, it will save this to your clipboard, ready to be pasted into Paint or any other application. If that doesn't work for you, be sure to just Google how to take a screenshot of part of the screen, and you'll see lots of videos that can help you with this as well. If you're using a Mac computer, on the other hand, this shortcut is going to save you a lot of time, and it might be worth noting this down in your notebook. When you use Command, Shift, and 4, you get this little crosshair that shows up, and you can start clicking and dragging the area that you want to take a screenshot with, and it will save it automatically to your desktop, which then you can upload into the Q&A area for the lecture. So that's just a brief step-by-step process on what to do and how to get help when you get stuck. And it's important to remember that everybody gets stuck sometimes. I've spent days trying to find a bug in my code, and it turns out to be just a comma that was misplaced or a semicolon that was accidentally deleted. And one of the greatest joys for me anyways is figuring out these problems and fixing them. So don't worry if you do get stuck. Everybody will try to help you. And just remember that getting stuck and solving it is all a part of the learning journey. Now let's get started by learning a little bit more about HTML. What exactly is it, and how do we use it to create websites? Now, no matter what browser you like to use, Chrome or Safari or Brave even, all of these applications do the same thing. They take different files such as HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and they render them into a website. But even though most modern websites are created using these 3 different file types combined together, you can't create a website with just a CSS file or just a JavaScript file. However, you can have just an HTML file. And in fact, that's exactly what the first websites were created with. HTML. Now, HTML defines the content and structure of the website. So, for example, in this case, all that my HTML file does is it renders a heading that says my website. And when this file is opened by the browser, it will display that heading saying my website. Now, what exactly is HTML? Let's break it down. So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. If we look at the first part, hypertext, what does that mean? Well, it refers to the pieces of text which can link to other documents in the website. So these pieces of text are hypertext or hyperlinks, and they are the foundation of how an HTML website works. Now, if we take a look at the world's first website created by Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who also happens to be the inventor of the internet, then you can see it's filled with these hyperlinks marked in blue. And exactly as you would expect, if you click on any of these hyperlinks, it takes you to another document, another HTML file. So if we go back, you can see that we were on project.html. And if I click on one of the hyperlinks, like how can I help, it will take me to another HTML file. And this is how hypertext works. And there's even a link on this website explaining exactly what hypertext is. So now that we know what hypertext is, what about the other part, the markup language? What is a markup language? Now, if you look at the English language, we often see little bits that function very similar to markup, like these double quotes. The presence of these quotation marks is what tells a reader that this part is a quotation. And as you'll find, this is going to be really similar to what you see in the editor's review of manuscript. So you used to mark them up and show different things, such as, for example, which parts need to be bold by adding a squiggly line underneath it, and which parts need to be underlined by adding a straight line through it. So how do you do markup with HTML? Well, it's done through what's called HTML tags. Now, in the early days of the internet, there were only very few HTML tags. These days, there are loads more, but realistically, you're only going to be using some of the most important ones, such as headings, H1 through to H6, or the paragraph tag, the P tag. So here you can see all of the HTML tags, but when we narrow it down to the ones that you actually need to know, then it makes it a lot more approachable. And in the rest of the course, we're going to be covering some of the most essential tags. And so don't worry about learning them. So don't worry about memorizing all of them or learning them. We're going to cover them as we need them in our projects and in our exercises. So in the next lesson, we're going to get started by learning about the heading tag, one of the most OG HTML tags that ever existed. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. Hi guys, in this lesson I want to quickly talk through how to get hold of the course resources as you're working through the course. In many sections of the course there will be downloadable resources, and they are usually in a compressed format, so you'll see the .zip as the file extension. Now what this means is that you can't use the files in this folder as it is. You have to extract the files out of this folder. And then once you've extracted it, you'll see that the folder contains many resources such as images or sounds or other things that we're going to use in the project, but also code files, which we're going to be using in order to complete some of the exercises and projects. So in order to download the course resources for a particular lesson, I want you to go into the resources for that lesson, which should show up with a folder icon. Click the down button and you'll see all of the links that are included in that folder. And in most cases, the download will be a zip file. So what I want you to do is to click on it, and download should start automatically in your browser. And then I want you to head over to your downloads folder. And if you're on a Mac computer, then you can simply double click on the zip file and it will automatically extract all of the contents into a new folder. Now on Windows it's a little bit different. All you have to do is to select the compressed file in your downloads folder, and then you should see at the top this extract all button show up. If you don't see that, then simply just right click on the compressed folder, and you should also be able to find that extract all. And then go ahead and simply select extract and make a note of the destination. Now, once you've done that and you've gotten hold of the extracted folder and all of the files that it contains, then I want you to simply drag it into your Visual Studio Code. And you'll see that VS Code will automatically open up your folder and give you access to all of the included files. If you try to drag a compressed folder into VS Code, it won't work properly. And sometimes you might be able to see the files, but you might not be able to work with it. For example, on Windows, you might be able to view the files, but it can create a lot of problems for you down the road. So remember, whenever you're downloading a file that has the .zip extension, be sure to extract the files before you work with it in VS Code. Now, in the previous lesson, we took a look at what HTML is, and in this lesson, I want to get us started using HTML as quickly as possible so we can learn how to write our own code and start creating websites with it. Now, in this lesson, we're going to be learning about one of the most important elements, the heading element. And this is what a heading element looks like. It starts off with what's called an opening tag here, and it ends with what's called a closing tag. Now, if you look closely, the opening and the closing tag actually have one thing that's different, and it's this / right here. And that is what makes this a closing tag. And what goes in between these two tags is the content of that particular HTML element. So in this case, what we're saying we want to do is we want to create a H1 heading. And what the heading is going to contain is these words, hello world. Now, very often when you hear me talking about HTML, you'll hear me refer to tags and elements, and you'll see this on the internet and everywhere else as well. So what exactly is the difference? Well, the tag refers to these bits. These are tags. Anything that's inside an angle bracket, we call these angle brackets, is a tag. And they have different names. So as I mentioned, this one is the opening tag. And this one at the end is, of course, called the closing tag. Now, these are the tags. So what's an element? Well, the entire thing here, this is an element. That includes the content as well as any opening or closing tags. This is the HTML element, and these parts are the tags. So hopefully that'll make things a little bit clearer the next time you hear about tags and elements. What is the purpose of these heading elements? Well, the idea comes from bookbinding. If you create a book and you create a table of contents like this one, you'll see that there's a sort of hierarchy, right? You've got the top level headings here. This would probably be a level 1 heading, and these would be a level 2 heading because they refer to something that's more or less related to this approval section. And you can see inside section 8 here, there's even another subsection, 8.1, which goes into more detail about some aspect of 8. This, in our case, might be an H3 heading. These levels are what we get to define using our HTML headings. This is what the code would look like for all 6 levels of headings. And remember that there is no heading 7. There is no such thing as an H7. That does not exist. Once you've gone to heading 6, that's pretty much the end as defined by the HTML people. And anything that's lower in importance, you would start using a different type of tag, which we'll go into a little bit later on. But for everything from 1 through to 6, the structure is pretty much the same. You've got an open tag, which is H1 or H6, and you've got a closing tag that has the corresponding number. Now, if you create a tag like this with an H1 and then you end with a different one, like an H6, then that's not going to work either. Just remember that when you're writing your own code. Now, what does this look like? If we were to run this code, this is what we would get. We would get different heading levels, and by default, they would be styled to have different sizes. So heading 1 being the biggest and heading 6 being the smallest. We can, of course, further style this later on, but as soon as we type these headings, it just gives us an indication of our levels to make sure that we've written all our code as intended. And this essentially follows that structure we saw earlier on with the table of contents. The level 1 headings are the biggest and the level 6 headings are the smallest. So now that we've seen a little bit about how all of this works, let's try an exercise where we create our own heading elements. To download the starting files, you have to go over to the course resources for this lesson and click on the 2.1 heading element file in order to download it. Now, if you don't know where that is, then you might have missed where at the very beginning of the course, there's a lesson called How to Download the Course Resources. And in there, I show you exactly how to download each of the course resources for every single lesson. So if you missed that, be sure to head over there to take a look and see how you can do this. Now, once you've downloaded this file, it's really important that you extract it, or what we call unzipping. Now, the first thing I want you to do is to create a folder for all of your web development projects. And you can create that folder anywhere you like on your desktop, in your C drive, in your username section, wherever you want, but just call it web development projects like this. Now, once you've created that folder, then I want you to go ahead and open up the zip file that you just downloaded by double clicking on it. And once you've opened up that zip file, I want you to drag it into your web development projects folder, like this. And then you'll be able to access them right here. Now, the next step is we're going to open it up in VS Code. Inside VS Code, go to File, and we're going to create a new window. Now, open up the Explorer here. And then when we're here, we're going to open up our web development projects folder that we just created. And you should be able to see that folder heading element. Now, if for some reason this is not working for you, especially if you're on Windows, this might be because you haven't actually extracted this folder properly. So again, make sure that you double click on the zipped file, or on Windows, you can also right click on it and click extract. And then once you've done that, drag that folder that's been extracted into your web development projects folder and open up that folder inside your VS Code. When you're here, you can see that there are 3 files in this folder called 2.1 heading element. One is the index.html. This is where you're going to be writing your code. And I've got some starting code for you, which we're going to need to modify in order to complete this challenge. Now, you've also got the solution, which I don't recommend looking at until you've completed the challenge, just to check your code or see if there's any differences. Now, notice how I've added a little bit here so that you don't accidentally see it unless you wanted to. But if you want to see the solution, just scroll down and you'll see it down there. The goal of this exercise is to make the code here create a website that looks like this. Remember previously when we did our setup and download for VS Code, I showed you how to install the extension Live Preview. If you don't see Live Preview when you click on extensions, that might mean that you've missed out on some parts of that video. So please go back to the setup and download videos for VS Code, because there's some other things that I need you to set up as well. Make sure you don't skip any of these lessons unless you know exactly what you're doing and you're really familiar with everything. What that live preview allows us to do is to go into our code file index.html, right click on it and click show preview. So it should now open up another pane, and you can see it shows us our book chapters, section 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, sections and diagrams and subsections. Unfortunately, everything seems to be just on one long line. And if you drag it out, you can see it's just one long line. There's no formatting at all, and there's no indication about hierarchy. So that's where the challenge comes in. You're going to use what you learned about heading elements in order to format this code here in the index.html so that we end up with something that looks like this. So we want the preview to show us heading 1 elements, heading 2 elements, heading 3 elements. And this one, this diagram 1, is actually a heading 4 element. So you should have H1 through to H4 in your code here. So now is the time to pause me in the video and try to complete this challenge. And after you're done, then you can resume the video and we'll walk through the solution together. Pause the video now and give it a go. All right, so we're going to have a single H1 element up here, which is going to be for this word book. So we're going to put an H1 element right here, and we're going to drag our book, which is the content, remember, in between these two tags. That's how our heading tags are formatted. Now, the next one are these chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3 sections, and they're all going to be the next level of hierarchy, which is an H2. So let's do that for all 3 of them. And then we can move on to our H3s, which is going to be the sections within the chapters. And now I'm just going to fast forward through the rest of the code so that you don't get bored. And then finally, this diagram, which belongs inside section 1 in chapter 2, is going to be the final and the lowest level of hierarchy, which is an H4. And once we've completed all of this code, you can check yourself against the solution code, and you should see it's pretty much the same. Now, one of the things that you'll find is when you hit save using Command S or using File, Save, you'll see that it auto-formats our code so that we lose any of the indentation. Don't worry if this happens to you. It's perfectly normal. And if we check ourselves against the solution, you can see they match exactly. And we end up with the same result as the goal image, which is what we were aiming for. How did you manage that? Don't worry if you got things wrong. This is where it's safe to go wrong and try things because we're just learning. There's no tests and there's nobody watching you. All that matters is you're actually learning stuff. That's what's important. Have a play around with the code. Don't worry if you do anything wrong. There's always a solution and me here to help you. There's a couple of things to note in terms of do's and don'ts when it comes to heading elements that I want to talk to you about. One important rule is notice how in our exercise there was only one H1. It's not good practice to have more than one H1s because the H1 is the very top level heading. Imagine the H1 as the book title and the table of contents as including the other parts. So maybe the H2 would be the first chapter. Don't have more than one H1. Instead, if you need another subtitle or another level of heading, then go to the H2 or H3 or all of the other ones up until H6. Now, the other thing to watch out for is don't skip a level when you're creating heading elements. Don't go straight from H1 to H3. If you have an H3, there should also be an H2 somewhere on that web page. Instead, I recommend to just go in order. When you have an H1 that you've created and then you realize you need another heading, then go to an H2. And then if you need another level of heading that's even lower in priority, go to an H3. don't jump between the different level headings. These are not things that will break your code. Your website will still look fine, even if you break all of these rules, but they're just rules for convention. And because we're going to be professionals, we're going to start off on the right foot and learn all the rules that we need to know. Now, if you wanted to read up even more on the HTML heading elements, then I recommend going to the professional tool, which is our Mozilla Developer Network web docs. And they have documentation for all of the HTML elements that exist. And when you read up on each of these pages, they tell you more details about things that you need to know. And they show you some interactive examples of how it all works. Now, I don't recommend reading through all of these for all of the HTML elements, but I do recommend that if you're going to use a new element that you haven't seen before and you don't know how it works, you haven't had a lecture on it, then I recommend just taking a quick look at the docs and seeing some examples about how they're used in a similar way that I've shown you in the lectures. Now that we've learned about one of the most important HTML elements, the heading elements, in the next lesson, we're going to move on to another super important element, which is the paragraph element. So for all of that and more, I'll see you there. So now that you've seen what you can do with the HTML heading element, the next one we're going to learn about is the paragraph element. And this is also related to formatting and putting text on our websites. This is what a paragraph element looks like. And similar to the heading element, you've got the opening tag and the closing tag. And in between, you've got the content that is going to be your paragraph. Now, the reason why we need a paragraph tag is because if you just had plain text in your HTML document, when you run the code and you see it on a website, what you'll see is something like this. The text, they run into each other onto the same line, and you can't actually tell where one paragraph begins and where the other ends. On the other hand, if we had created two paragraph elements for these two lines, then when we run the code, you will see them being separated with a line in between to be able to distinguish the different paragraphs. And this is also really important for people who are using screen readers, so people who might be blind, because what the screen reader will do is they'll see the beginning of each paragraph element, and it allows the blind user to be able to skip to the next paragraph easily and be able to see what's going on each time. Now let's put those skills into practice by trying an exercise using the paragraph element. If you head over to the course resources for this lesson, you should be able to download the zip file for the 2.2 paragraph element. And once you've extracted and unzipped it, then go ahead and put it into your web development projects folder and then open it up inside VS Code. I showed you how to do all of this in the previous lesson in HTML heading element, as well as the initial lesson when I showed you how to download course resources. So be sure to check those places if you don't know how to get hold of this folder. But once you have it opened up like this, then I want you to go ahead and open up the index.html file, which, as always, is where we're going to write our code. Notice here we've got 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph, the second paragraph, and the third paragraph. And then there's some placeholder text in Latin, which doesn't mean anything. It just is there so that you can see what a paragraph of text would look like. And when you go ahead and right click and show preview, you should see that all of the paragraphs are jumbled together into one long line. And we can't tell where one paragraph begins and the other one ends. So now it is your mission to solve this problem using what you've learned about the paragraph element. So go ahead and format these 3 paragraphs using the paragraph tag. And once you're done, you should see the preview show something like this, where each paragraph is separated into new lines, and clearly visually we're able to see the difference and we're able to distinguish these 3 different paragraphs. Pause the video now, and once you're done, we'll go through the solution together. All right, we're going to use our paragraph tag. So we're going to put the open tag here, just in front of our first paragraph, and then we're going to put the closing tag at the very end of our first paragraph. And then we're going to repeat that basically for all of the other paragraphs. Now you can see here, I'm just clicking and dragging. Alternatively, you can cut it and then paste it at the very end of the paragraph. It really doesn't matter how you do it, as long as you get those tags in the right places. And now, hopefully, your preview should have updated and you can see these paragraphs forming as we type. So this looks pretty much the same as our goal. And if you check the solution HTML, you should see the p tags in the correct places as well. So hopefully that wasn't too hard and you were able to do it all by yourself. And you've seen now what is the benefit of using a paragraph element to separate text into different paragraphs of content. Now, what you saw in the exercise are bits of placeholder text, and it's what we would refer to as lorem ipsum. It's something that you'll come across quite a lot, especially in web design. It's so that we don't end up with something like this, where we're trying to simulate content in a paragraph, but then we're just writing content, or this is a paragraph, this is a paragraph, this is a paragraph. And the reason why we don't want to do this is because these are all the same words. The sentence has the same length. It doesn't look like what a natural block of text would look like. And we don't have the time or energy to actually create the content just for testing and web design. So that's why we use something called lorem ipsum. And lorem ipsum apparently comes from Latin classical literature by a famous author called Cicero, if you've heard of him, and it's over 2,000 years old. And this has been in use in the print industry for many, many years, ever since the 1500s even, where people started laying out newspapers, and when they didn't have the content for the layout, they would use this placeholder text. If you want to get hold of some, you can go over to lipsum.com. And there you'll find lorem ipsum even in different languages like Dutch or Polish. And you can use this tool to generate as many paragraphs or words or bytes or lists as you need by simply using this generate button. And here I've got 5 paragraphs ready to go to put into my new web design. Now, instead of having something that looks like this, where everything's all the same length, instead, we have very natural looking paragraphs that mimic pretty much what a regular English article would look like. And this is done in a matter of seconds using lorem ipsum. Now, if lorem ipsum is a little bit too boring for you, there's actually some novelty versions of this. One of my favorite is baconipsum.com. And it will generate similar to lorem ipsum, but then you'll get words like bacon and flank and pork loin and pork belly. Now, if you're not a meat eater, then maybe you should try something like broipsum.com, where you can have all of the bro terminology in a lorem ipsum format. And apparently the things that bros say are things like taco, pow pow, and washboard, and rail, and heli pow pow, whatever it may be. And if none of these take your fancy, then I recommend going onto Google, and you can actually find more of these kind of things by just searching for funny lorem ipsum. And there's a whole bunch of different ones like vegan ipsum or pirate ipsum, and you'll come across all sorts of different placeholder text generators. But the important thing is you know how to get hold of them and you can use it in your code. So as an add-on challenge, if you want to, you can generate your own version of lorem ipsum, bacon ipsum, or bro ipsum, and you can create an article using the paragraph tag and the lorem ipsum that you've generated. Feel free to modify the index.html in the coding exercise that we just completed. So have a play around with that, and be sure to comment in the Q&A sections below if you find some lorem ipsum that you think is ridiculous or really funny or really cool. And I'll see you on the next lesson. All right, so in this lesson, we're going to learn all about HTML void elements, such as the horizontal rule and the break element. What exactly are void elements? Well, we've seen what non-void elements are, such as the paragraph element or the heading elements, and they're not void because they have content right here in between. A void element is an element where you are forbidden from putting any content inside the tag. And in fact, the tag itself even looks very different. So this is a horizontal rule element, and you can see that it starts out with an angle bracket, ends with an angle bracket, but then right here there is this / just before the end of the tag. You might think this looks a bit like the closing tag of a normal HTML element, but it's actually subtly different, because here in the closing tag, that / is just after the opening angle bracket. It's right here in front of the letter. Whereas in the void elements, the / is actually just before the end of the tag. And normally by convention, you'll see a little space here as well between the tag name and also that /. This is just something to be really careful about when you're creating these void elements. Make sure that you've got the / slashing in the right direction, so this way, and not a backslash like this. So when it points to the right, then it's a /, and when it points backwards, then it's a backslash. So what does this look like when we add it to a HTML document? Well, here we've got our previous 2 paragraphs, and right in between the 2 paragraphs, I've added a horizontal rule, which will hopefully help us divide the content to show that this part is not related to this part, and we've got some sort of separation in between. When we run this code or when we view it in a web browser, this is what you would see. You would see the first paragraph, the second paragraph, and then you would see this horizontal rule, or basically a horizontal line where the HR element would be in that document. Now, the horizontal rule is not the only void element. Another common one you'll see is the break element, and it looks like this. Now, similarly, again, we've got the name of the tag, and then we've got that /, and then we basically end the tag. So there is no opening tag, there is no closing tag, there is only a single tag that looks like this, and the name of the tag goes right before the /. Now, how does the break element work? Well, it's really useful when you have things where you need to separate things onto separate lines in order to have the correct meaning. For example, if you have poems, they are in fact meant to be in the same paragraph, but they should really each be on different lines in order to make the rhyming work, or in order to make the structure of the poem correct. So this is a poem from one of my favorite poets, William Blake. And in order for it to work, we can't have it all run in one line, even if it's in the same paragraph. If we had this code right here, even though, yes, it is all in the same paragraph, it is all related to each other, and this does make sense, but you don't look at poetry like this. It doesn't really work. We don't know where we're supposed to breathe and how we're supposed to read out the poem. So instead, we can add our break elements that we just learnt about. Our void element doesn't have any content in it, but it just shows where the breaks in this paragraph has to go in order for this poem to look right. And when this HTML document is rendered, this is what you'll see. A perfect layout for a poem. To see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wallflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. And it's all beautifully formatted thanks to each of our break elements at the end of each line. So now it's your turn to try an exercise using these void elements. So go ahead and download the starting files for this exercise from the course resources for this lesson. And when you've extracted it and opened it up, this is what you should see in the index.html. We've got the name of our poet, William Blake, and this is apparently his real address that he lived at some point in life. And then we've got 2 paragraphs from Wikipedia, which briefly describes the poet. And I want you to use everything you've learned so far in order to format this HTML document so that it will look like the goal that I've got right here for you. As you can see, this top level, the name of our poet, is going to be rendered as an H1 because that is the most important thing about this particular web page. And then we've got the address of the poet, which is rendered as a paragraph. But notice that addresses, even though they are a single paragraph, they again need to be broken up into separate lines using our break element. And then finally, we've got a horizontal rule that separates the address and the name of the author from the little bit of description of this author, which should sit in 2 separate paragraphs. Now I want you to pause the video and edit the index.html so you end up with this goal PNG when you preview this website instead of this jumbled block of text that we have at the moment. Pause the video now and give this challenge a go. All right, so hopefully you've given it a go and everything worked out. I'm going to run through the solution. So first we said we were going to have an H1 for his name, and then we're going to have a paragraph tag that encloses the address. Now, in order to have that address on different lines, we're going to add our break element to the end of each line. And remember, our break element is a self-closing tag, so we're going to create it like so. Now, I'm going to go ahead and simply copy and paste it to the end of each line, and you can see how nicely our address is now formatted. And finally, we wanted these 2 paragraphs at the end to be separated. So I'm going to go ahead and simply do that. And now we are pretty much golden. We've achieved our goal output. We've got our H1, our address separated, and the only thing we need to do is to add that horizontal rule between the address and the 2 paragraphs. Let's go ahead and add the other void element that we learned about, and now we've completed the challenge. And you can check yourself against the solution to make sure that everything that you did looks exactly the same. Now, a neat trick I like to use is to simply copy the solution and go to diffchecker.com, paste in the solution code, and then paste your code, and then go ahead and click Find Difference. And it should highlight all the places that are different in case you've misspelt something or you've done something wrong. So for example, in this case, in our version, there is a space after the word Blake and the closing tag, which in terms of HTML will not make any difference. But had I instead maybe written the H1 incorrectly and I didn't write the H for the closing tag, then you can see our output looks completely different and we're looking through all of this text. We don't know why it's happened. So we go ahead and copy it and then diff it to the solution, and it should highlight the fact that that is incorrect. And we should now be alerted to check the difference. That's one tip that I have for you today. And let me just go back to our index.html, fix this bug, and we should now be ready to go. Now, in terms of do's and don'ts with void elements, sometimes you see people doing is they add a break tag to add a new line instead of creating a separate paragraph element. Now, this is not what you want to do because this is not very good for accessibility, which means it'll make it harder for blind users with screen readers to understand the content on your website. So I recommend you always create new paragraph elements when you have new paragraphs and use the break element only when there is some sort of reason why you would want to separate the different lines in a single paragraph, but it still is a single paragraph, such as in the case of a poem or in the case of an address that we covered in this lesson. Now, the final thing to mention is that sometimes when you look at the horizontal rule element or the break element, you might see it represented without this final closing tag. You might see people simply write this, and this is perfectly valid HTML. So you could, in fact, have a horizontal rule that looks like this. You could have a break element that looks like this instead of the one with the / at the end. And these are both valid options. You could go for this or you could go for this. As of HTML5, the latest version of HTML, what it's starting to do is it's starting to ignore this / at the end. So it doesn't even look at it. It sees the first part and already knows that a break is a void element and a horizontal rule is a void element. So it doesn't actually need to keep reading. But I recommend to write your code with this end / and the reason is because when you read your code, you as the human, it'll be much easier for you to see that this is a void element and it doesn't need a closing tag, so that you don't end up being confused and you can identify the void elements and the non-void elements easily and distinguish them from each other. So that's just a quick tip and something to alert you to when you see it written like this on the internet. Both versions are valid. You can pick and choose, but I recommend going with this version. So now that we've gotten an introduction to HTML, I want you to put everything you've learned together in order to create a new project. So the project that we're going to be building today is called the Favorite Movie Project. It's going to be a website to keep track of all of your favorite movies that you've watched. When you go to rogerebert.com, he is one of the greatest film critics of all time, in fact. He's passed away now, but he's got movie reviews and ratings for all the movies that he's watched, and you can see that when you go to his website. I think this is a really great way of keeping track of what you've watched, because when friends ask me for recommendations, I can never remember what it is that I've watched in this year that I really like and what to recommend. So what we're going to be building today is a very simple website. It's going to be a website that tracks your favorite movies, maybe of all time, maybe of the last year, whatever you want to do. And the requirement is you should have at least 3 movies that you put in here. So what you're going to need is to create a H1 as the title of the website, and then you're going to have an H2 as the subtitle. And then you're going to have a horizontal rule as your void element in there. And then you're going to have 3 movies that you're going to list. And they're all going to be created using the H3 element. And then finally, you should have a section which is going to be a paragraph element that's going to describe why you liked those movies. And this is basically a very simple format for this website. Now, feel free, once you've done all of this, to continue to mod this website, to change it up, to add things, to add break elements, whatever it is you want to do. But at the minimum, I want to see all of these elements represented on a page. And of course, feel free to add your own movies, and I would love to see in the Q&A a picture of your website to see what it is that are your top movies, and maybe I'll get some inspiration to the next time when I have movie night and I can't figure out what to watch. So I'm curious to see your recommendations as well. So go ahead and download the movie ranking project zip file from this lesson's course resources. If you don't know how to do that, again, go back to one of the first videos in the course at the very beginning of section 1, where I showed you in a video how to download course resources. And once you've unzipped it and extracted it, then open it up in VS Code and go ahead and code to your heart's content using everything you've learned. Pause the video now and give that a go. Now let's go through the
Hmm. Restrain ini kan. Nah, ini main jadi.
Solution. In my case, I'm going to have an H1 at the top, which is going to be the title. So, top movies of all time, according to Angela. And then afterwards, I'm going to create a subtitle, which I will write my best 3 movies. And then after that, we were going to add a horizontal rule to separate this part from the actual content of our website. And I'm going to create an H3 to represent each of the movies I'm going to recommend. So I'm going to recommend Spirited Away, which is one of my favorite animes. And I'm going to use paragraph tags to describe a little bit about why I like it. So I'm just going to call it favorite anime. And then the next movie will be Ex Machina, and I really liked it because it's
Ex Machina movie.
And then finally, the third one is going to be the movie Drive with Ryan Gosling because it was really beautifully shot. Cool. This is the basics of what you would need to have done for this project. It has all of the elements that were required, and you can see in the goal PNG that it's got all the things that we've described, even if the text is a little bit different. Of course, it won't be according to Angela for you, it'll be according to your name. And now that you've done that, feel free to add different things in here as you would want. Maybe add a bit more to the paragraph tags. Maybe add a poem about your favorite movie. Go crazy, try out things, and share in the Q&A your project as a screenshot. If you don't know how to do a screenshot, be sure to type that into Google. How do I create a screenshot? And then you can add it into the Q&A. We can all look at your favorite movies and be inspired. So I hope you enjoyed building the project together. And in the next section, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into some more intermediate aspects of HTML. So for all of that and more, I'll see you there. Well done for completing the first module. You've already come so far just by taking the first step. Because you know that most people who buy online courses, they never get started. So you're already one step closer to your goal. But we all know that at some point later on, things will get more difficult. It will get more challenging. I can promise you this already. So how can you keep this current level of motivation that you have and be able to carry it through to the difficult times? One of the things that I find really helpful is setting goals and having my goals around me, like displayed on the wall while I'm working or while I'm studying. So I've created this fantastic worksheet for you so that you can start thinking about why you're doing this. Why are you learning to code? Why are you learning this skill? What will you be able to achieve once you've mastered it? And what would your life look like once that happens? So head over to the next lesson, fill out the sheet with your answers, and then print it out and put it somewhere where you can see it. So that when things become difficult and when your motivation takes a nosedive, you can have a look at it and remind yourself of why you're doing it in the first place. So head over there now. Hey guys, in the previous lesson, you've learned a lot about different types of HTML elements and you already started using
Nanti aku lagi ini.
websites. Now in this section, we're going
Coding.
to take it a
Ya program ya.
little bit further and explore some more
Kursus program punya.
intermediate and advanced
Bagus. Nggak selamanya. Ini memang kampus wajibkan punya. Belum ada kabar. Belum ada kabar.
HTML. We're going to get started.
Bebas. Yang penting selesaikan aja. Yang penting kalau dikerjakan kamu selesaikan aja.